The photograph is barely visible now, faded by time and water damage, but if you look closely, you can still see them. 17 people standing in front of a barn somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia. The year, written in careful script on the back, is 1883. What's strange about the photograph is not the people themselves, though their faces carry an expression that's difficult to describe, something between resignation and anticipation. What's strange is what they're holding. Each person, from the oldest man who appears to be in his 70s to the youngest girl who can't be more than 6, holds a length of rope, not draped over their shoulders, not coiled at their feet, held taut, stretched between them in a pattern that makes no immediate sense, a web of connection that seems both deliberate and ritualistic. The barn behind them is ordinary enough, weathered wood and a peaked roof, but the door is open, and inside that darkness, if you enhance the image, if you look at it long enough in the right light, you can see something hanging. Something that might be cloth, something that might be something else. The Whitlock family took this photograph 3 days before what they called the gathering, an event that occurred once every generation, an event that no one outside the family ever witnessed, an event that shaped the lives and deaths of everyone who carried that name for over 100 years. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Whitlock family arrived in what would become Braxton County, West Virginia, in the autumn of 1859. They came from Virginia, though before that, the records are unclear. Some documents suggest they'd originated in Pennsylvania. Others hint at a European origin, possibly German or Dutch. What is certain is that when they arrived in Braxton County, they numbered 12 individuals. Ezekiel Whitlock, age 47, his wife Constance, age 42, and 10 children ranging in age from 23 to 4 years old. They purchased 320 acres of heavily forested land in a valley so remote that even the native population had largely avoided it. The deed, recorded at the county courthouse, shows that Ezekiel paid in gold coin, an unusual method of payment for the time and place. The clerk who processed the transaction, a man named Morris Pendleton, later wrote in his diary that Ezekiel Whitlock had strange eyes, pale gray and unblinking, and that he'd spoken very little during the entire process, only what was absolutely necessary to complete the purchase. The Whitlocks built their homestead deep in the valley, nearly 4 miles from the nearest neighbor. They constructed a main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and what witnesses who visited in those early years described as a chapel, though it bore no cross and no religious symbols of any kind. The structure was small, perhaps 20 feet square, built of stone rather than wood, with no windows and a single heavy door. When asked about it, Ezekiel told people it was a family meeting house, a place where the Whitlocks could gather for private matters. The neighbors, few as they were, thought this odd but not particularly alarming. Many families in the region maintained private spaces for religious or personal practices. The Whitlocks kept to themselves, but they weren't unfriendly. They traded at the general store in Sutton, the county seat, bringing furs and ginseng to exchange for supplies. They attended community barn raisings and harvest festivals, though they never invited anyone to their own property. Constance Whitlock was known for her skill with herbal remedies and was occasionally called upon to help with difficult childbirths or illnesses. The children were quiet, well-behaved, and educated, which was unusual for frontier families. They could all read and write, even the youngest. For the first 8 years, the Whitlocks lived in relative normalcy. They expanded their farm, cleared more land, raised crops and livestock. 3 more children were born during this period. The family prospered in their isolation. Then, in the spring of 1867, something changed. A traveling preacher named Silas Drummond was making his circuit through Braxton County, offering services to the scattered families who lived too far from established churches. He stopped at the Whitlock homestead on April 19, 1867. What happened during that visit is recorded in Drummond's own journal, which was donated to the West Virginia Historical Society in 1922. Drummond wrote that he was received politely by Ezekiel, but was told firmly that the family did not require religious services. When Drummond asked if he might at least offer a prayer for their continued health and prosperity, Ezekiel became agitated. He told Drummond that the Whitlocks followed their own traditions that went back generations, and that outside interference was not welcome. Drummond, sensing hostility, departed quickly, but as he rode away from the property, he looked back and saw something that disturbed him deeply. In his journal, Drummond wrote that he saw the entire Whitlock family, all 15 of them including the youngest children, walking in single file toward the stone chapel. Each person carried something, though from a distance Drummond couldn't identify what. They moved with what he described as processional solemnity, no one speaking, no one looking around. They entered the chapel one by one, and the door closed behind them. Drummond waited, watching from the tree line for nearly 2 hours. The family did not emerge. He wrote that he felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, a feeling that what was happening inside that stone building was not worship as he understood it, but something else entirely. He left the area and never returned. In his journal, he added a note: "I have traveled these mountains for 20 years and witnessed many strange practices among isolated families, but the Whitlocks are different. They are not merely secretive. They are bound to something, and I fear that something is not of God." The Whitlock family continued their isolated existence. The children grew, married, and some of them left to establish their own households, though they never moved far. By 1875, several Whitlock families occupied different parts of the original property, creating a small clan settlement. They rarely intermarried with outsiders. When they did, the outsiders who married into the family seemed to change over time, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, adopting the same careful reserve that characterized all the Whitlocks. A woman named Sarah Mackey married into the family in 1876, becoming the wife of Jonathan Whitlock, Ezekiel's second son. Sarah's sister, Martha, later told a census taker that Sarah had been a lively, talkative girl before her marriage, but within a year of joining the Whitlock family, she'd become almost unrecognizable. Martha said Sarah would visit occasionally but would never discuss her life with the Whitlocks, would never answer questions about their practices or beliefs. Once, Martha asked Sarah directly what happened during the family gatherings she'd mentioned. Sarah's face went pale and she said only, "We keep the tradition. We must keep the tradition." When Martha pressed her, asking what tradition, Sarah stood up and left, and Martha never saw her again. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1881, a government surveyor named Charles Whitman was mapping property boundaries in Braxton County. His work required him to survey the Whitlock land. He arrived at the Maine homestead on July 7, 1881, and was met by Ezekiel Whitlock, now 73 years old but still vigorous. Ezekiel granted permission for the survey, but insisted on accompanying Whitman throughout his work. Whitman later filed a report with the land office that included more than just survey data. He wrote that the Whitlock property was well maintained and prosperous, but that certain areas seemed deliberately avoided. The stone chapel, which Whitman observed from a distance, was surrounded by bare ground in a perfect circle approximately 30 feet in diameter. No grass grew there, no plants, just bare earth that looked hard-packed and strangely dark. When Whitman asked about it, Ezekiel said only that the ground had been prepared for specific purposes. Whitman also noted that he'd seen what appeared to be markers, small stones carved with symbols he didn't recognize, placed at intervals throughout the property. Ezekiel became visibly upset when Whitman approached these markers and asked him not to disturb them, saying they were family graves. But when Whitman checked the county death records later, he found no record of any Whitlock deaths since their arrival in 1859. This absence of death records became increasingly conspicuous as time passed. By 1885, 26 years after the family's arrival, Ezekiel Whitlock should have been 77 years old. His wife Constance should have been 72. Their oldest children should have been in their 40s and 50s. Yet when census takers visited in 1880 and again in 1890, they reported that all the original family members appeared to be in good health and, strangely, didn't seem to have aged as much as would be expected. The census taker in 1890, a man named Robert Gill, wrote in his notes that Ezekiel looked perhaps 60 years old, not the 81 he claimed to be. Gill attributed this to good mountain air and hard work, but he also noted that when he asked Ezekiel about his longevity, the old man had smiled and said, "We keep ourselves well through family practice." Gill asked what kind of practice. Ezekiel's smile faded and he said nothing more. The first documented gathering, the event that would define the Whitlock family for generations, occurred in September of 1886. The exact date is unknown, but several pieces of evidence point to the last week of that month. A farmer named Dutch Harding, who lived approximately 6 miles from the Whitlock property, reported to the county sheriff that he'd heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitlock Valley on the night of September 23rd. He described the sounds as rhythmic, like chanting or singing, but in no language he recognized. The sounds continued from dusk until dawn. Harding said he'd considered riding over to investigate but decided against it, later telling his wife that he'd felt an overwhelming reluctance to approach the Whitlock land that night, as if something was warning him to stay away. 2 days later, a traveling merchant passing through the area reported seeing thick smoke rising from the Whitlock Valley, not the thin smoke of cooking fires but dense, black smoke that suggested something large was burning. The sheriff, a man named Albert Cross, rode out to the Whitlock property to investigate. He found the family going about their normal business. When he asked about the fire, Ezekiel told him they'd been clearing brush. When Cross asked about the sounds Harding had reported, Ezekiel said the family had been singing hymns. Cross accepted these explanations, though he later told a deputy that something about the visit had unsettled him. He said the Whitlock family all bore the same expression, something he described as simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, like people who just completed some enormous physical labor. What actually occurred during that first gathering remained unknown to outsiders for many years, but over time, fragments of information began to surface. In 1903, a woman named Elizabeth Farrow died in Sutton. She'd been born Elizabeth Whitlock in 1861, one of the younger children of Ezekiel and Constance. She'd left the family in 1884 after marrying a merchant named Thomas Farrow against her family's wishes. According to her daughter, Clara, Elizabeth had been estranged from the Whitlock family for the rest of her life. On her deathbed, Elizabeth asked to speak with a priest. The priest, Father Dennis McCarthy, later wrote a letter to his bishop describing what Elizabeth had told him. The letter still exists in the archives of the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston. In it, McCarthy wrote that Elizabeth had confessed to participating in what she called a family ritual when she was 25 years old in 1886. She said all the Whitlocks gathered in the stone chapel for 3 days and 3 nights. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. They performed ceremonies that Elizabeth refused to describe in detail, saying only that they involved blood, that they involved binding, and that they involved something she called the passing. McCarthy asked what was being passed. Elizabeth said it was difficult to explain, but that each generation received something from the previous generation, something that had been carried by the family since before they came to America. McCarthy asked if it was an inheritance. Elizabeth said it was more than that. She said it was a burden and a gift, that it extended life but demanded participation, and that those who refused to participate or who tried to leave as she had done were cursed to die young. Elizabeth was 42 years old when she died. Father McCarthy investigated Elizabeth's claims. He rode out to the Whitlock property in 1904 and was turned away at gunpoint by several Whitlock men who told him he was trespassing and would be shot if he didn't leave immediately. McCarthy reported the incident to the county sheriff, but the sheriff, who by this time had developed a policy of avoiding the Whitlock family unless absolutely necessary, took no action. McCarthy wrote to his bishop that he believed the Whitlock family was engaged in practices that were not only unchristian but dangerous, possibly involving human sacrifice. The bishop, who had more pressing concerns in a rapidly growing diocese, told McCarthy to leave the matter alone unless he had concrete evidence of a crime. McCarthy, frustrated but obedient, dropped the investigation. He died in 1907, but his letters survived, providing one of the few contemporary accounts of what outsiders suspected about the Whitlock family. The second documented gathering occurred in September of 1912, 26 years after the first. By this time, Ezekiel Whitlock had died, his death finally recorded in 1907 at the claimed age of 99. Several of his children had also died, though their ages at death were all significantly higher than average for the period. The family was now led by Jonathan Whitlock, Ezekiel's second son, who would have been in his 70s but who, according to those who saw him, looked perhaps 50. The gathering of 1912 was noted by several people in the surrounding area. The same phenomena occurred: strange sounds at night, heavy smoke, a period of several days when no one saw any member of the Whitlock family in town or on the roads. A schoolteacher named Agnes Thornton, who taught at a one-room school about 8 miles from the Whitlock property, later wrote in her diary that several of her students, children from families that lived near the Whitlocks, had been absent for a week in late September. When they returned, they seemed frightened and refused to explain where they'd been. One boy, she wrote, had marks on his wrists that looked like rope burns. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The pattern was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. Every 26 years, the Whitlock family gathered for an extended ceremony that outsiders were never permitted to witness. But what was the purpose of this ceremony? What were they doing in that stone chapel? The answers began to emerge in the 1920s, when the third gathering approached and several former members of the family, people who'd married in and then left, began to speak more openly. A man named Robert Keene, who'd been married to a Whitlock woman named Patience for 3 years before she died in childbirth in 1916, told a reporter from the Braxton Democrat that the Whitlock family believed they carried what they called the inheritance. Keene said Patience had described it as a kind of collective life force, something that had been passed down from the first Whitlocks in America and perhaps from even earlier generations in Europe. The ceremony, according to Patience, was necessary to transfer this force from the older generation to the younger, to renew it, to keep it strong. Keene said Patience had been terrified of the gathering, that she'd begged him to take her away from West Virginia before it occurred, but she died before they could leave. He said she'd told him that the ceremony required sacrifices, though she'd never explicitly said what kind. The reporter, a young man named William Cassidy, became fascinated by the Whitlock story. He began investigating, collecting accounts from anyone who'd had contact with the family. He interviewed former neighbors, merchants who'd traded with them, even a doctor who treated some of the younger Whitlocks for minor injuries over the years. The doctor, Clarence Morton, told Cassidy something disturbing. He said that in his experience treating 3 generations of Whitlocks, he'd noticed physical abnormalities that seemed to run in the family. All of them had unusually low heart rates, sometimes as low as 40 beats per minute, yet they showed no signs of illness. Their blood, when he'd drawn it for testing, was darker than normal, almost purple. And they all had the same strange mark on their left shoulders, a birthmark or scar in a pattern that looked deliberately made, like a brand. When Morton had asked about it, the Whitlocks had told him it was a family trait, something they were born with. But Morton didn't believe it was a birthmark. He believed it had been inflicted, probably in childhood, as some kind of initiation mark. Cassidy published his findings in a series of articles in the Braxton Democrat in the spring of 1938. The articles created a sensation in the region. For the first time, the Whitlock family's practices were being discussed openly in print. Cassidy's final article, published on April 12, 1938, included a prediction. He wrote that based on the pattern of previous gatherings, the next one should occur in September of 1938, 52 years after the first and 26 years after the second. He announced his intention to observe the gathering, to finally document what the Whitlock family did during their secret ceremony. He solicited help from readers, asking if anyone would accompany him. No one volunteered. On September 15, 1938, William Cassidy drove alone to the Whitlock property. He never returned. His car was found 3 days later parked on a logging road about a mile from the Whitlock homestead. The doors were unlocked. His notebook was on the front seat, open to a page where he'd written a single sentence. "They know I'm here." Cassidy himself was never found. The county sheriff, under pressure from Cassidy's family and the newspaper, organized a search. Nearly 50 men combed the area for a week. They found no trace of William Cassidy. When they attempted to search the Whitlock property itself, they were met by more than 20 Whitlock family members, all armed, who formed a line and refused to allow anyone to pass. The sheriff, lacking a warrant and unwilling to start a shooting war, backed down. The case was never solved. Cassidy was declared missing, presumed dead. The incident with Cassidy brought unwanted attention to the Whitlock family, but it also created fear. People in Braxton County began to understand that the Whitlocks were not merely eccentric or secretive. They were dangerous. They would kill to protect their traditions. After 1938, no one investigated the family. No one asked questions. The Whitlocks continued their isolated existence, and the rest of the county pretended they didn't exist. But the story didn't end there. In 1964, 26 years after Cassidy's disappearance and 78 years after the first gathering, something happened that broke the pattern. A young woman named Margaret Whitlock left the family. She was 28 years old, the great-great-granddaughter of Ezekiel Whitlock. She'd participated in the 1964 gathering, and it had broken something inside her. She fled to Charleston, the state capital, and went to the police. She told them that her family had murdered William Cassidy. She told them that her family had been murdering people for over a century, that the ceremonies involved human sacrifice, and that she could prove it if they would protect her. The Charleston police contacted the FBI. An agent named Thomas Ridley was assigned to investigate. Ridley interviewed Margaret extensively over several weeks. Her story, as recorded in FBI documents that were declassified in 1998, was almost unbelievable, but Ridley found her credible. Margaret explained that the Whitlock family practiced what she called longevity transference, a ritual that required the life force of outsiders to be absorbed by the family during the gathering. Every 26 years, the family would identify someone who'd shown too much interest in their practices, someone who posed a threat. That person would be captured, brought to the stone chapel, and over the course of 3 days, their life would be taken in a ceremony that involved all members of the family. Margaret said the ceremony was ancient, that it had been brought from Europe by the first Whitlocks, that it required specific implements, specific words, specific actions. She said William Cassidy had been the sacrifice in 1938. She said there had been others before him, though she didn't know their names. She said the ceremony worked, that her grandparents, who should have been in their 80s, looked 60, that the family aged slowly, that they rarely got sick, that they lived far longer than normal people. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Agent Ridley believed Margaret, but he needed evidence. He needed bodies. He needed physical proof of these alleged murders. Margaret told him that the bodies were buried on the Whitlock property in unmarked graves near the stone chapel. She drew him a map. Ridley took the map and Margaret's testimony to a federal judge and obtained a warrant to search the Whitlock property. On November 3, 1964, Ridley led a team of FBI agents and West Virginia State Police to the Whitlock homestead. They expected resistance. They came prepared for it with more than 40 armed officers. But when they arrived, the property was deserted. Every building was empty. The Whitlock family, all of them, had vanished. The searchers found evidence that the family had left in a hurry. Food was still on the table in the main house. Clothes were still in closets. But there were no people, no vehicles, no indication of where they'd gone. It was as if the entire family, numbering at least 30 individuals by 1964, had simply evaporated. Ridley ordered his team to search for the graves Margaret had described. They used the map she'd provided and focused their efforts near the stone chapel. They dug for 3 days. They found 7 graves. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, but forensic analysis determined they'd all died within the previous 100 years. One body, identified through dental records, was William Cassidy. The others could not be identified. All showed signs of ritual killing, identical wounds, positioning of the bodies, evidence of binding. The FBI opened a full investigation. They issued warrants for the arrest of every adult member of the Whitlock family. They searched for them across the country. They found nothing. The Whitlock family had disappeared completely, leaving behind only their property and the evidence of their crimes. Margaret Whitlock was placed in protective custody. She remained there for 2 years, living under an assumed name, waiting to testify against her family if they were ever found. They never were. In 1966, Margaret was released from protective custody and given a new identity. She moved to California and tried to start a new life. But the trauma of what she'd experienced, what she'd participated in, never left her. She struggled with depression and guilt. She told her FBI handler that she could feel her family searching for her, that they would never stop looking, that leaving them had marked her for death. In 1971, Margaret Whitlock, living under the name Susan Caldwell, was found dead in her apartment in San Diego. The death was ruled a suicide. She'd taken an overdose of sleeping pills. But the FBI agent who'd been monitoring her, who'd become something of a friend, told colleagues that he didn't believe it was suicide. He said Margaret had been terrified in the weeks before her death, that she'd called him multiple times saying she'd seen members of her family watching her apartment. He said she'd told him they'd found her, that they were coming for her because she'd broken the most sacred rule of the Whitlock tradition. She'd revealed the secret. The agent requested an investigation, but the local police found no evidence of foul play, and the FBI, dealing with more pressing matters, let the case close. The Whitlock property in Braxton County was seized by the state of West Virginia. It sat abandoned for years, becoming overgrown and decrepit. The stone chapel, that focal point of a century of horror, was demolished in 1975 by order of the county government, which wanted to erase any trace of what had happened there. But the demolition crew reported strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioned. Workers fell ill. One man claimed he'd seen figures in the woods surrounding the chapel, watching them work. The foreman, a practical man named Dale Summers, said he'd felt an overwhelming sense of dread the entire time they were working, that the stone itself seemed wrong, heavier than it should be, darker. When they finally broke through the walls and roof, they found the interior of the chapel was covered in symbols, carved deep into the stone, hundreds of them, covering every surface. The symbols were photographed before the demolition was completed, and those photographs still exist in state archives. Linguists and historians have examined them but can't identify the language or tradition they come from. Some symbols resemble Celtic or Germanic runes. Others look like no known alphabet. The consensus is that they're a hybrid, a system created by the Whitlock family themselves, used exclusively for their rituals. After the demolition, the property was sold at auction. Several owners tried to develop it over the years, but none succeeded. Houses built there suffered from persistent problems. Structural failures, contaminated wells, unexplained noises. Most were eventually abandoned. In 2003, a developer from Pittsburgh bought the land with plans to build a resort. The plans never materialized. During preliminary excavation, workers discovered more graves, 8 of them, all unmarked, all containing bodies that showed signs of ritualistic killing. The developer abandoned the project. The property was condemned and has remained empty ever since. Today, it's accessible only by a dirt road that's almost completely grown over. The few people who have ventured there in recent years report a persistent sense of unease, a feeling that the land itself is watching, waiting. The question that haunts everyone who studies the Whitlock case is simple. Where did they go? How did an entire family, 30 people or more, disappear so completely that no trace has ever been found? The FBI investigated for years and came up with nothing. No one using the Whitlock name has appeared in any database since 1964. No one matching the descriptions of known Whitlock family members has been identified. It's as if they ceased to exist. Some investigators believe the family had been planning for this possibility for years, that they had escape routes established, new identities prepared. They suggest the Whitlocks split up, scattered across the country, changed their names and appearances, and blended into the general population. This is the most rational explanation, but it fails to account for certain facts. 30 people, including children and elderly individuals, leaving in such a coordinated fashion that they left no trail whatsoever, is almost impossible. Someone would have been seen. Someone would have made a mistake. But there's no record of any Whitlock being spotted after November of 1964. Other theories are darker. Some suggest the family committed mass suicide when they realized their practices had been exposed, that the graves found on the property are not the only graves, that somewhere in those mountains there's a mass burial site containing the remains of the entire Whitlock clan. Searches have been conducted, but the area is vast and difficult to navigate. If such a site exists, it hasn't been found. A more disturbing theory, one that has no rational basis but that persists in the folklore surrounding the case, is that the family didn't leave at all, that they completed some final version of their ceremony and transcended, for lack of a better word, that whatever they'd been building toward for over a century finally came to fruition. This theory suggests the gatherings were not just about longevity, but about transformation, about becoming something other than human. It's a theory born of fear and superstition, but it reflects how deeply the Whitlock case disturbed the people who knew about it. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the years since 1964, there have been occasional reports of Whitlock sightings, though none have been confirmed. In 1983, a woman in Oregon reported that her neighbor, an elderly man who'd moved in recently, had the characteristic birthmark on his left shoulder that Margaret Whitlock had described. The woman contacted local police, who investigated but found nothing suspicious. The man had documentation proving his identity, and while he bore some physical resemblance to photographs of Whitlock family members, resemblance is not proof. In 1997, a genealogist researching Appalachian families claimed to have found descendants of the Whitlocks living under different names in 3 different states. She published her findings online, but when investigators followed up, they found that the people she'd identified had no connection to the original Whitlock family. They simply shared similar genetic markers common in populations of German descent. The genealogist recanted her claims, saying she'd made errors in her research. The most disturbing report came in 2012. A hiker in the mountains of West Virginia, not far from the original Whitlock property, claimed to have stumbled upon a clearing where approximately 20 people were gathered around a stone structure. The hiker said the people were wearing old-fashioned clothing and appeared to be conducting some kind of ceremony. When they noticed him, they stopped and turned toward him in unison. The hiker said he felt such overwhelming terror that he ran without looking back. He reported the incident to park rangers, who searched the area but found nothing. No clearing, no stone structure, no people. The hiker, who had no history of mental illness and no reason to fabricate such a story, insisted on what he'd seen. He described the people as having pale gray eyes and an unsettling calmness. Park rangers noted his description but took no further action. The hiker never returned to that part of the mountains. The legacy of the Whitlock family extends beyond their disappearance. The case changed how law enforcement approached isolated religious or cultural groups, leading to better protocols for investigating suspected abuse or criminal activity in closed communities. It also contributed to the study of folie à famille, a psychological condition where an entire family shares the same delusion. Some psychologists have suggested that the Whitlocks weren't practicing actual ritualistic murder or life transference, but rather suffering from a generational delusion, a shared belief system so powerful that it dictated their behavior for over a century. This theory attempts to rationalize the irrational, to explain away the supernatural elements of the story. But it doesn't account for the physical evidence. The bodies, the symbols, the documented longevity of family members, the coordinated disappearance. If the Whitlocks were delusional, they were functionally delusional, able to maintain their beliefs and practices while appearing normal to outsiders for generations. The stone chapel, even after its demolition, continues to exert a pull on those interested in the case. The site where it stood is marked on some maps, though you won't find it on any official tourist routes. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators occasionally venture there, though local authorities discourage it. The few photographs that exist of the site show nothing remarkable: a flat area of ground, slightly darker than the surrounding soil, roughly 20 feet square. But people who visit report feeling watched, feeling unwelcome, feeling that something is waiting there, patient and ancient. These reports can be dismissed as suggestion, the power of knowing what happened in that place creating a psychological response. But the consistency of the reports, from people who had no contact with each other, and in some cases didn't even know the full history of the site, suggests something more. Whether that something is genuinely supernatural or simply the lingering trauma imprinted on the land itself is a question without an answer. The FBI officially closed its investigation into the Whitlock family in 2007, declaring that after 43 years with no leads, the likelihood of ever finding the missing family members or prosecuting anyone for the discovered murders was effectively zero. The case files were archived, but some investigators never stopped looking. Thomas Ridley, the original FBI agent who'd worked with Margaret Whitlock, continued searching for the family on his own time until his death in 2015. In his personal notes, discovered by his daughter after his death, Ridley wrote that he believed the Whitlock family had not dispersed, but had relocated as a unit to another isolated area, possibly in the Pacific Northwest or Alaska, where they could continue their practices without discovery. He'd spent years following up on reports of isolated family groups living off the grid, families that shared the Whitlock characteristics: secrecy, longevity, resistance to outside contact. He'd never found conclusive evidence, but he'd remained convinced that somewhere the Whitlocks still existed, still gathered, still performed their ceremonies. His final note, written just weeks before he died, read, "They're out there. They're still keeping the tradition, and someday someone will find them or they'll find us." The mystery deepens when you consider what Margaret Whitlock had told Ridley about the ultimate purpose of the gatherings. According to Margaret, the ceremony wasn't just about extending life or transferring life force. It was building towards something. Each gathering, every 26 years, added to a cumulative effect, a generational accumulation of power or knowledge or some quality that Margaret struggled to articulate. She told Ridley that her grandfather had once said the family was preparing for what he called the culmination, a final gathering when the accumulated power of all the previous ceremonies would be released or utilized. Margaret didn't know what this meant, and her grandfather had refused to explain further. But he'd told her it would happen when the family had conducted 10 successful gatherings. The first gathering was in 1886. The 10th would have been in 2012, 126 years later. But the family had fled in 1964 after only 4 gatherings. They'd never reached the culmination, never completed whatever they'd been working toward for over a century. Or had they? What if the 1964 disappearance wasn't a flight but a transformation? What if they'd found another way to reach their goal? If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? There's one more piece to this story, something discovered only recently that casts everything in a different light. In 2016, a historian named Dr. Laura Kensington was researching colonial American religious movements and came across a reference to a group called the Longwalkers, a heretical Christian sect that had existed in Germany in the 16th century. The Longwalkers believed that human life could be extended indefinitely through ritualistic absorption of life force from others, a practice they claimed was based on ancient pre-Christian traditions. The sect was violently suppressed by both Catholic and Protestant authorities, and most of its members were executed. But some fled, first to the Netherlands, then to England, and eventually to the American colonies. Kensington found passenger manifests from 1687 showing a family named Whitlock, which translates roughly to Whitlock, arriving in Pennsylvania from England. The manifest noted that the family was traveling together, 12 members, and that they'd requested to be settled in an isolated area away from other colonists. Kensington traced this family forward through colonial records and found that they'd moved several times, always to increasingly remote locations, always maintaining their isolation. By 1859, they'd reached West Virginia. The Whitlocks weren't an ordinary family following unusual practices. They were the last surviving members of a heretical sect that had been practicing ritualistic murder for over 300 years, possibly longer. Kensington published her findings in an academic journal in 2018. The article received little attention outside of specialist circles, but for those familiar with the Whitlock case, it provided context that had been missing. The Whitlocks weren't inexplicable. They were the continuation of a tradition so old it had been forgotten by everyone except those who practiced it. The gatherings, the ceremonies, the symbols carved into the chapel walls, all of it connected back to the Longwalkers, to a belief system that predated modern Christianity and that had survived through generations of persecution by hiding itself away in the most remote corners of the world. This revelation makes the case somehow more terrible because it suggests that the Whitlocks might not be unique, that other branches of the Longwalkers might exist elsewhere, practicing their traditions in secret, gathering every 26 years, working toward their own culminations. So we return to the question that has no answer. Where are the Whitlocks? Are they scattered and hiding, living normal lives under false identities, forever cut off from the tradition that defined their family for centuries? Are they dead, buried somewhere in those dark mountains, having chosen death over exposure? Or are they still together, still gathering, still practicing, having found another isolated place where no one will disturb them, where they can continue what they started in 1886 and what their ancestors started 300 years before that? The FBI has closed its investigation. The property where they lived has been condemned. The people who knew them are dead or silent. But the story remains, passed down through the communities of Braxton County, told in whispers to outsiders who ask too many questions. The story of a family that lived too long, that knew too much, that practiced things human beings were never meant to practice. The story of the Whitlocks and their tradition that no outsider was allowed to witness. And somewhere, in the darkness of the Appalachian Mountains or in some other isolated place, there might be a stone building with no windows and a single heavy door. And inside that building, there might be people gathering, preparing for a ceremony that's been performed for hundreds of years, a ceremony that continues whether we know about it or not. The Whitlocks might be gone, but the tradition, that terrible tradition, might still be alive, waiting for its culmination, waiting to reveal what 100 years or 300 years or 1,000 years of accumulated darkness can achieve.